welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance in the Crawlspace studios in Wormtown. Lance, how are you?
Doing pretty well, all things considering. How are you today?
Yeah, all things considered. So this episode is part 2 of what you heard in the episode right before this, and maybe yesterday if you're listening to this in real time. This is part 2 of our conversation with our friend Bill Thomas, who discusses the Colonial Parkway Murders.
Bill Lee continues his conversation with us about those murders, the Parkway murders that happened back in the 80s. His sister, of course, Cathleen Thomas, she was 27, and she was murdered with her girlfriend, Rebecca Andowski, who was 21. That happened on October 12th, so right around the anniversary here in 1986. And there were other couples. I think they totaled 4 couples, plus a few others that might have been linked to it. But Bill has been an advocate for this for years, and he is a friend of the show, and he brings a lot to the table every time he comes into the studio. And he's also very complimentary about the conditions in the studio.
Yes, and so if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we recommend that because these conversations go together. And Lance, now the bad news of the day.
Big announcement. You were right all along, Tim. You will not be joining me on the boardwalk in New Jersey for a cup of coffee any weekend in the near future.
That is accurate.
You were right the whole time, Tim.
You're right now. Now I see that you're right. I was right, but I'm not proud of it. I'm not happy today. The American Crime Fest has been canceled, and we are no longer affiliated with the American Crime Fest, and we are so sorry that this happened. It's really such a frustration and depressed moment for us, to be perfectly honest about all this. We are so sorry we dragged all of our friends into this, and it's canceled.
Well, you're right. We are no longer affiliated with the American Crime Fest. It is unfortunate that it was canceled, but as we've been told by a few people, maybe it was for the best that it happened now, and the way things had been trending internally, I think that that's probably accurate, that it's probably best that it happened now and it didn't turn into a sort of an S show on the day of. That being said, it sucks for us a little bit, but I'm really more disappointed that this amazing lineup of presenters and podcasters and advocates mostly who were given this platform to talk about their cause and to talk about the things that they're passionate about, to have people who have agreed to go on a stage and talk to people about wrongful convictions, their personal stories, their stories about their family members and how they're advocating for justice in their cases. That's all gone because of a business decision that we had no control over, and we're going to do our best to make something out of this anyway. So just stay tuned in the next week or so. Here at the Crawlspace Studios in the think tank, as we call it, there's at least 2 people, maybe 4, maybe 6, who are brainstorming ways to
6 dozen.
6 dozen.
Let's be honest. We've got a growing brain trust in the think tank.
in the Crawlspace think tank. If you can imagine that, so you crawl down this tunnel and there's this think tank and there's a bunch of people in there saying, how can we make this better? But joking aside, it will be there will be something that will come out of this, whether it's a form of maybe a virtual, live Q&A or panel with all of the as many of the panelists that we lined up for this particular event. Maybe we could do something over the course of a couple of weekends in November where nobody has to fly out to a convention center on the ocean of the Atlantic. As much as having a coffee with me on Saturday morning is tempting, maybe we could just do that virtually and then listen to Bill Thomas and Gemma Hoskins chat over a virtual fire.
Yeah, so we will figure it out. There are options, and we apologize, and we feel terribly about it. And if you booked tickets, please contact the American Crime Fest organizers. We're trying to move forward now, so please enjoy part 2 of Bill Thomas in the Crawlspace Studios discussing the Colonial Parkway Murders.
Did we just meet at the ASOC conference this past spring?
We did, April 2019. I feel like we're old friends already.
I know.
It's only been 6 months.
I truly can't believe that we only met 6 months ago.
I know, it feels like 6 years.
A lot has happened in 6 months, and not in a negative way. You're not like saying, oh my God, we've been hanging out with Bill forever. It just, the comfortability factor is here.
I just, that came up early, just a little while ago, and I just can't believe it's only been 6 months.
Yeah.
Honestly, it feels like we've known each other for a couple of years.
Feels
but
good.
Jim can be a little abrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Jim's like this genius guy, but can be a little clipped sometimes in the way he interacts with the world. And the first time he did it, I was like, well, what did I do wrong? That kind of thing. But he explained, hey, why he's trying to keep his palate clean, as you said. And I have to respect how the process works. It's very interesting.
Was he holding back just for camera purposes?
No, this is no camera.
Personal,
this is just, Jim and Bill in a rental car kind of thing. And we're just, on the Colonial Parkway. And I'm starting to point out stuff. And it's funny, we shot a bunch of footage there last year. And he said to me a couple times, save that for the camera. I want to hear that for the first time while we're rolling.
Yeah.
So that I can offer the most, genuine first impression reaction as possible. Because, while the cameras aren't rolling and we're standing there, at the site where the car was found, I'm starting to point out all sorts of things. And Jim's like, wait, just hold on.
Yeah.
I just want to hear that once, and then I'll talk to you more about it.
Yeah.
And, then we're
it's almost actually kind of reminds me of the way you film a comedy movie, to be honest.
Okay.
Because it's like you say something off script, and it's like, well, wait, let's do that. Let's do that when everyone's ready for that, because we want the honest reaction, and that's when you get the best stuff.
That's interesting, though, that Jim is a law enforcement professional, an FBI profiler, and he can talk to you about this personal case, and he can still balance that with being a producer. Like a television,
he's got a lot of stuff going on in his head, I would imagine. And I guess he doesn't have the improv skills that the two of you have.
Well, he's never done Murder Mystery Dinner Theater.
Well,
Right.
there
Comedy.
you go.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys have talked about that at length.
With Jim, yeah.
He calls us up. He's like, guys, I got an idea for a murder mystery script. I don't know where to go with it.
I got to find the funny in it.
I got to find the funny in it. This guy's got a magic pair of shoes. They get stolen. What do I do?
And, of course, now, Jim was a writer-producer on Criminal Minds, which has just
Yeah.
wrapped a very successful, who knows how many years on TV. So he's got to look for new avenues for his creativity.
Very impressive guy and company, and really happy that you're working with them. We of course had Jim Clemente on the Missing Maura Murray podcast to discuss what he thought a profile of Maura's killer would look like.
Oh, wow.
If Maura
I've
was
never
killed.
heard the episode where Jim talks about profiling a perpetrator in the Maura Murray case.
Yeah, it was interesting. We kind of gave him some information. He didn't really know much about the case coming into the interview, and so we kind of fed him some information, and he basically took the path of, if Maura had been killed, what their behavior would be like, and where they would live, and things like that. It was really interesting.
It was really cool to get somebody on with his pedigree, with his background, to talk about something that wasn't right, like in his wheelhouse. He had very, very basic information about the case, and it was so refreshing to hear someone tell you something that you didn't think of because you're so immersed in it. Like, where her car was found, was it right off the highway? And at first I think we were like, yeah, it was right off the highway. He goes, well, what's right off the highway?
Yeah, what's
2
that mean
minutes
to you?
And we're like, well, depending on which highway, like between like 10 and 20. And he's like, that's not right off the highway. And we're like, oh, that's actually a really good point. It's not it's not right off the highway at all. He goes, so what does that tell you? Then we're like, I don't know, Jim, you tell us. No.
That fresh perspective, and I mean, this is a guy who trained with John Douglas, and I mean, he's the real deal. And it's fascinating, actually, to have a conversation with him about an unsolved murder case, and to hear, to see the wheels turning through the plate in his head, and no, it really is fascinating. It's funny. in that example, how far? What is this off 93? If you went up,
It's about a half an hour, say, from 93 maybe,
Yeah.
and probably 10 minutes
10,
from
15
91.
Got
So,
it,
Yeah.
got it.
And so I think his point was that this wasn't like a truck driver driving the highways who maybe dipped off for gas and disposed of a body right along the highway.
correct.
It was something that mostly locals travel, and that was kind of his point.
Right. It's funny. I'm a University of Massachusetts at Amherst grad, and I was just up there a couple of weeks ago. Some folks are thinking about holding a forensic genealogy conference
Ooh.
next year
Oh, yeah.
at the university. And so I was up there with 2 forensic genealogists, and the Redgraves, Anthony and Lee Redgrave, who are with the DNA Dope Project. Really amazing couple. And they asked me to come up and talk about the possibility of holding a conference like this. And of course, I was back on the University of Massachusetts campus for the first time in a couple of years. And we ended up talking about Maura Murray because of our mutual interest in the case and being back in Amherst and, what that was like for me. And by the way, I thought UMass was looking fantastic. A lot of things I recommended a few years ago at a meeting with the chancellor, not that they did them because I pointed them out, have been done.
Yeah.
And so there's new buildings on campus, and they've renovated the campus center. They're rebuilding the student union building, and there's students everywhere, and that was really kind of fun to be up there for the day.
Yeah.
And I thought, I got to get back up here more often now. Those students are, they don't want to hear my stories from
Hey.
Oh,
a
stop it. Of course they do.
a million years ago. But it was great being back there. But it's funny, it sort of put Maura's disappearance kind of top of mind for me again, being back on campus.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So what do you do when you pull up into campus and you were talking about Maura? What was the nature of that conversation?
Well, just what the town is like and campus are like now versus what they were like when she was an undergrad.
Gotcha.
And of course, I was there, years before. Just kind of the topography and how someone, let's say she was headed north, how she would have left campus and town. And I know, from listening to other episodes of your podcast and watching the television series, a little bit about places where she was seen, and you can sort of track a little bit of her trajectory, at least while she was in Amherst.
Yep. Liquor store, ATM, highway.
Right, exactly. And again, this is in an environment where there were more video cameras scattered around, security cameras of different types, than there were back in the era of the Colonial Parkway murders.
Yeah.
It's funny, I go out and speak to students pretty frequently about our case, and people are always asking me questions like, well, is there any security cam footage? And it's like, except for 7-Eleven, not too many folks had security cameras.
There was no highway cameras. I forgot if we even asked you that before.
No, I don't know that you did. But we predate all that stuff. Of course, we predate DNA coming out of the lab too. So and it's funny. I mean, students will ask me all the time, well, could they have called on their cell phone? And it's like, this is 1986. There is no cell phone. There is no internet. Security cameras are extremely rare. I mean, a lot of that stuff came online from a security cam perspective after 9/11.
Right.
We've seen a lot of changes in the last.
And the Boston bombing too. I feel like that changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's funny, in the Boston bombing example, there's a situation where all of that security camera footage from retail stores lining the street, who weren't necessarily placed there to record a bombing or even to record the Boston Marathon crowds and runners out front, but the FBI and the Boston Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, did an amazing job of moving very quickly to kind of recreate. And I know a lot of us saw that stuff on television.
Yeah, they asked for citizens' help too. I think that was sort of an interesting step that isn't taken very often. I guess.
No, I think they definitely looked at the situation. There was hundreds of people there. Somebody must have seen something. So yeah, I feel like it was a no-brainer for them to just say, people saw something. We need to ask the people, what did you see?
Yeah, although there was, we also saw the downside of some of that too. Remember when they very quickly were sadly misidentifying people as potential perpetrators who ended up being completely innocent.
Yeah.
And people were, getting way ahead of themselves, identifying potential suspects and saying it's so-and-so, and it turned out not to be.
Right, and then pointing out the person, then trying to identify the person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, you see the issues with online sleuthing, in a couple of days, and we still deal with that issue today. I mean, we talk about it all the time, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, we're part of that community also.
It's there, it's happening. You just have to figure out how to wrangle it.
Well, I think like a lot of things in life, one of my favorite expressions is always trying to find that balance. In other words, I think that the interest in true crime and the participation of audience members like the Crawlspace and Maura communities, it can have great benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And, look, I'm willing to stay up till past my bedtime to talk to a guy who thinks he might have information in my sister's unsolved murder case. Now, obviously, I've had this conversation, dozens and dozens of times. I actually said this to the guy last night because he hadn't heard from me yesterday because I was at meetings, and he said, well, I assume you've already gone to the FBI and your lawyers. And I was like, you haven't told me anything that I would.
He thought that you went to the FBI and your lawyers just because he contacted you?
Well, first of all, I don't think I have any lawyers. I haven't needed any lawyers.
We have Lance Reenstierna, Esquire, right here.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
So, okay, this guy reaches out to you, and he's with information. He says he has information, and you're going to get on a call. When you get on the call, he says, I just assumed you already went to the FBI and your lawyers.
Which I thought was a little strange. I will go to the FBI.
Is that a red flag to you that this guy doesn't have anything, or is it more like, wow, maybe he does have something?
Well, I just thought it was odd. I mean, I actually said to the guy, "Look, I've had this very same exact conversation scores of times before. So understand, I'm more than happy to have this conversation with you, but there's no way I go to the FBI and my lawyers, of whom I have none, to discuss, talking with you tonight. You haven't told me anything particularly substantive yet." He did get into a lot more specifics, and if I can figure out if there's something there, obviously I'm going to turn that over to law enforcement. But I found it a little ironic. And it's funny, he's in a queue of like 3 or 4 other people who reached out to us in the last 24 hours, directly, it seems, as a result of the television show coming on, as near as I can tell. Great. All these folks are reaching out to us. Please call me. Here,
Great.
I want to talk to you about the Colonial Parkway murders.
I feel like this is back in the day, if someone does something like this, because they don't have the outlet of social media to maybe have a release, like I feel like more people talked about their crimes back then because they needed to release it somehow.
You talking about perpetrators?
Yeah, I'm just coming up with an idea about why someone would reach out, so many years later, 30 years later, to say I have information on this because they saw an ad for a TV show. I feel like they might have heard something from somebody because that person just needed an outlet for it, and then that person's account when they went to the police just got lost in the mix. I just created that entire scenario in my head.
Well, maybe so. I still find it a little bit baffling that people will come to us. And sometimes I've thought to myself, I don't usually let these words cross my lips, but I have thought to myself, where you been for the last 30 years?
Right. Okay. So my 7-minute question or observation was basically that. Like, why do you think if they had information, where did that go?
Well, the experts tell me, because I've asked this question before, because over the 33 years in the Colonial Parkway murders, a lot of people have come forward, especially in the last 10 years, since the families have gotten more heavily involved. And, I've been much more involved in pursuit of answers in the Colonial Parkway case. They tell me that situations change. In other words, relationships end, people die, people get divorced, work relationships are changing, and so things that people might not have been willing to discuss at one point are now changed by circumstance, and so people will come forward now. And it's funny, I think the advent of this new television series, I think, is going to bring people forward. And it's funny, one of the investigators said to me, "Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet."
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. So then, was that your experience with that person you spoke to last night? Is that someone who knew someone or he thinks might be involved or something like that?
Yeah, without getting getting into any specifics. Yeah,
Interesting.
And it's funny, he's put down a few markers. I've got to circle back with some law enforcement people and say he's referenced this incident and this incident. And I never lived in Virginia.
Yeah.
I never lived near Williamsburg. My sister and my older brother Richard were both brought there at different times by the United States Navy and their service in the Navy. Kathy after graduating from the Naval Academy, and Richard, my older brother, as well. So I've never lived in Virginia. And so, for instance, this guy referenced other significant criminal activity that I have no knowledge of, but I can circle back with some law enforcement folks and say, hey, this guy's referencing this and this. Did that happen? My guess is that these things did, and these would be, pretty memorable, I think, from a law enforcement perspective. But it'll be very interesting for me now to try to nail down some more information. Now, he's referring me to another guy that he wants me to talk to who also might be able to fill in some blanks here. And it's all news to me.
Yeah.
But it does line up with a few things that I know.
Sounds like a pretty credible source. And I know, Lance, when we've done some more Murray stuff, and we'll hop on the phone with people mostly years ago, but you kind of look for things that connect to stuff you've already heard or things that you know to be true. And that sounds like that was kind of the case with him, where he was hitting on some things you knew, and then he went further.
Right. And, of course, one of the things I want to try to do in all of these situations is try to draw these people out. And, whether the FBI likes this or not doesn't really matter from my point of view, because remember, we're talking about 33 years of stops and starts and some significant disappointment on the part of the families. So if someone reaches out to me, I'm going to speak to them first. Now, what I try not to do is, if someone's got something that might have just even a small percentage of a shot of being something meaningful, I am going to turn it over to the investigators, because I cannot judge ultimately whether this might line up with something that they know about a particular person or situation. In other words, it might make a bell go off in our FBI agent's head she knows things I'm never going to know. And so ultimately, once I sift through this a little bit, I am going to try to get this information to her. And of course, this guy had said to me he wanted to talk to me, and he didn't want to talk via email or text or any of that stuff. He wanted to talk over the phone. Now, is that significant? I'm not sure. But once we got to the phone, he starts naming names. And I thought, oh, this is interesting.
He's specifically saying this person is responsible for this murder?
Well, he's not sure about that, but he's saying, I think, your investigators should be looking into the background on this guy and that guy and so on.
Were those names you had heard before?
No.
Really?
And it's funny, there I am dutifully writing it all down. And again, we'll see where it goes. I'm not saying, we cracked the Colonial Parkway murders last night on the phone. But, he's in line with, I'm not kidding, 4 or 5 other people that have reached out to me just recently. And I thought to myself, I think I'm going to try to knock off one of these a night, because you can often talk for an hour or more.
When you say in line, he's in line with the same information that you're getting?
No, but I've got like 4 or 5 other people who've reached out to me just in the last, few days who've said, I'd like to talk to you about the Colonial Parkway murders, or I'd like to talk to you about your sister's murder.
And you have a pretty good sense of what a person's like on their first impression when you're on the phone. I mean, if this guy sounded at all sort of tapped, you'd probably identify that, I would imagine.
We've only run into that a few
Right.
dozen times.
Right. So you're used to that.
But as you both know, sometimes you talk to people that may be more than a bit damaged by whatever. And I still have to remind myself, just because somebody comes across as a little bit odd or a little out there or whatever, that doesn't mean they're not worth talking to.
Well, here's the thing. You're talking about someone who is telling you details of a terrible, horrific crime that obviously would take a damaged person to commit. So you're not tapping into a collection of people that are very well put together in the first place.
But I think that goes both ways too. Like you can talk to someone who sounds very with words all put together very, very well and sounds real logical, but it's not the case when you get deeper.
Yeah, I mean, we have an expression that I like a lot, which is, I'm not sure this person's completely screwed down to the deck.
Oh, I like that.
I like that one.
And, my dad was a naval officer, and my older brother and younger sister. So, but at the same time, I still have to remind myself, don't judge. You're also talking about people that, we're talking about something that happened 30 years ago. So memories are fuzzy, sometimes mine included. And then, so you've got the passage of time, and you might mix in the use or abuse of drugs, alcohol, psychological abuse, what have you. So not everybody's going to be able to give you the most coherent narrative. The other thing is I'm struggling with this on a personal level. As you guys could probably tell from our previous conversations, I try to approach things in a pretty logical way. But remember, ultimately, I'm seeking answers in Kathy's murder and the Colonial Parkway murders. And I think I have to remind myself, Bill, you're looking for logical answers in an inherently illogical act. I mean, for the most part, killing someone, except perhaps in self-defense, is not really a particularly smart, logical thing to do. And so people are performing these acts at a time and a place when they're not necessarily in their right mind. And so when I'm trying to take this sort of hyper logical, well, why did this happen? And then, why were these young people killed? Ultimately, when we find the answers to the Colonial Parkway murders, and I think we will, I'm not sure that it's going to be a very satisfactory answer. It's just going to be an answer.
Yeah. I mean, do you hope that it'll be this nice, neat package, but realistically, it's probably not going to be that, so you're preparing yourself for it?
I think it's the latter. I think this whole thing, just like murder, is messy, and I'm not sure all the Colonial Parkway murders are even necessarily all related. Yeah. And so But I'll take a series of messy answers rather than no answers at all.
Yeah, even if you were to find a killer or killers and they were to be arrested and brought to some theoretical justice, like, can't imagine the family members of the Golden State Killer victims are particularly satisfied. I mean, they're happy that the guy's outed.
That's about as
jail.
neat a package as you can get wrapped up.
But you don't get any emotional answers.
You don't get
that.
You
don't know why that guy did that.
You got one guy, one series of crimes.
Yeah.
And it feels very neat. But still,
you're right.
Where's the emotional satisfaction?
It's not there.
I mean, he's even getting like his justice is like prevailing here, but still, like, well, the guy did kill, my brother or my sister or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on top of that, Joseph D'Angelo. I mean, I think they've got this guy dead to rights, and yet it's not like he's talking.
Right.
And it's funny. One of the things I was struggling with. Listening to a true crime writer, I went to hear her speak about her book. Her name's Ann Howard, and she wrote a book called His Garden, and which is about a series of murders in Connecticut. And fascinating, wonderful writer, and an interesting person. I had coffee with her a few months ago and went to hear her speak. But it's funny, when she was talking about William Devon Howell, who's the perpetrator in the murder series that she explores. I think it's 7 or 8 prostitutes from the Waterbury, Torrington area of Connecticut. The way she described William Devon Howell, who maybe not by coincidence is from Newport News, Virginia, which is right where the Colonial Parkway murders took place. I think that guy could be good for more murders, and he's in jail currently serving a 360-year sentence.
Whoa.
That guy's never getting out of jail. And she was talking about him, and she did a very good PowerPoint presentation, really interesting photographs. She even warned us, there may be one or two spots that might be a little bit disturbing. We all got through it. But I was sitting there thinking, this guy could be good for other murders. And from my perspective, I thought, it'd be so meaningful if he was able to come forward, since he's never getting out of jail, that if he could come forward and offer some degree of comfort to other families to let them know that he's also responsible for their missing or murdered loved ones. And yet, from what I've read and heard from experts, it's rare that someone like Howell will actually confess to additional murders. I'm not sure why.
Unless there's something to gain, I think.
I don't know.
Well, the guy's got 300-something years in prison, right?
Yeah, 360 years.
Because of his confessions?
Yeah, I think it's 60 years for 6 murders, and then he got a 15-year sentence for I think it's a total of 7. And so he got credit for time served. But I mean, so I think he's got 300 and something years to go, and my guess is he's not getting out of jail anytime soon.
Yeah, I wonder if that makes you not want to confess because you were punished for it.
Well,
I think the idea that serial killers just want the notoriety is a little overblown, probably.
Well, Ann Howard made a really interesting point in when I heard this book talk the other night, which I found fascinating. She said he told her he found the death penalty actually provided what my words sounded like a reverse incentive. This is what his thinking was. Once he killed the first prostitute, he raped her, tortured her, and killed her. He found the death penalty idea very freeing because he realized he was, at that time, Connecticut had the death penalty. They've since done away with it. But at that time, he found it very freeing because he realized after he'd killed his first victim that he was, if ever caught, was going to receive the death penalty. So he knew in his mind that at that point, if he was ever caught, he was dead. So he actually found
stockpile.
Exactly. He actually went out and committed all those other murders with a greater sense of freedom. I never thought about it this way. He actually went out and killed all those other people with a greater sense of freedom because he knew he was dead if he was ever caught anyway.
Playing with house money.
Yeah, he looks at it like he's got nothing to lose.
Yeah, which
Wow.
I had never. I guess I still struggle sometimes to put
You're
myself
not a psychopath.
in the mind of a psychopath, which I guess is a good thing.
Yeah.
But I'd never thought about it. It was like a complete reverse where people insist that the death penalty is going to prevent violent crime. And, I know some people that passionately believe in the death penalty. I'm not among them. But, at the same time, I might reserve the right to change my mind if we ever had a person or persons to focus on in the Colonial Parkway murders. But I found it fascinating that William Devon Howell took the idea of the death penalty and it actually created an incentive. Once he'd actually crossed the line, he was then free to do anything he wanted because he was going to be dead anyway.
And that was before he was even caught. So
Yeah.
that's interesting that goes into a criminal like that's mentality. I wonder, that's like the best case to not have the death penalty that I've probably ever heard.
Right.
Because it actually backfired in that case.
And I'm not making the argument at this
Yeah.
moment. I'm just saying fascinating for me to sit through Anne's excellent presentation. And then she mentioned that and I sat there and I was like, wow.
Yeah, because who's the death penalty for? It's for someone like that, right? It's not for the impulsive person who comes home and their lover is in bed with someone else and they shoot
Crime
that
of
person.
passion.
Right. It's not for that. It's not built for that.
Right.
It's built to kill someone who's killed other people.
Yeah.
And they don't think that person can be reformed, which this William Howell would fit, I would imagine.
I guess, but I don't know if the this guy's clearly a sociopath, and it's funny, she went into a significant amount of his background, and you could, you had a pretty decent understanding of where this guy, turned to the, not just to the dark side, but I mean, really kind of spooky, and it was probably a good presentation for me to sit through. But there were some moments where it was eye opening.
So on that note, I wonder, what do you happen to think about this killer sometimes, and do you think about what the killer is doing right now?
Yeah, sometimes.
What do you think?
Well,
What do you picture?
33 years have gone by. This guy has got to be probably older than I am. So he's got to be in his 60s, I would say. And it's entirely possible that he's still alive. He or they are still alive. And I keep thinking, wouldn't it be great if somebody whose circumstances have changed, whether it's him or them or somebody that knows them, steps forward. I'd love to see this perpetrator's life upended.
Yeah.
Now, when you earlier said that when you get information, you will sift through it and you will sort of vet it on your own, but you will always take it to law enforcement after. Do you follow up on your own? Not with law enforcement, but with the person that gave you the information? If it's like sort of a location thing, do you ever travel to go follow up with it? And I'm asking because I know that I keep going back to how long it's been and, why people talk. And it's pretty typical that people don't talk to law enforcement. They'd rather talk to somebody like you with information. So you're almost getting unadulterated information. You're getting about as clean of information as possible.
Unfiltered.
Yeah. Totally unfiltered. Yeah. It hasn't been delivered to the police. They didn't go to the police first. They went to you first, and you're the one taking it to the police. So what's your obligation at that point?
Well, if I try not to act like much of an additional filter because, look, the FBI doesn't like that I do this. But, I really put myself out there, as we've talked about before. I have the same cell phone number I had since the first cell phone I got. I still use the same AOL email address. I have Gmail and other addresses, and I've always had work addresses. But I've really put myself out there to make myself relatively easy to find. And as we talked about, my name's not John Smith, but when your name's Bill Thomas, you guys both
God,
have,
your name's not John Smith.
Well, you guys have really cool, distinctive, hard to pronounce Italian names. But for those of us that have stock,
Swedish, but
is it really
Scandinavian? Yeah,
Reindeer star.
I didn't know
That's
that.
how it's pronounced.
Yeah, I'll take Italian. I mean, they do make great food.
Jeez, watch my color me embarrassed here.
Don't be embarrassed.
Swedish.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I met the woman from Sweden True Crime. She does a podcast, and she came to the Chicago True Crime Podcast Festival, and she was
and of
from
course
Sweden.
she's 6 foot tall and blonde and gorgeous.
she was-
so you
yes.
wanted to say hello.
Yes, beautiful blue eyes, and I was speaking to her for a few minutes. I told her.
Wait, are you Swedish too?
No, my last name is Italian.
Okay,
you hit that.
I'm not like a complete chump.
No, and to be fair, you could look at my last name and think it's Italian.
It ends with an A.
Ends
I
in
mean,
a
Yeah,
ends in a
it
vowel.
ends in a vowel.
I told that woman that the translation was reindeer star, and she was like, "Yeah,
Oh,
This is true?
yeah, no, that's
For
true.
real?
Yeah, But you can call him Reindeer Star if you want. If you can't pronounce Reenstierna.
Thomas and Thompson are actually the same name. And so ours is boring. Ours is son of Tom.
Right.
I mean, Reindeer Star is
Tom's a
way
cool guy.
cooler. No, people have to
Thompson
understand,
Star.
all three of us, I think, are from Boston originally. And so in Boston, you're always trying to figure out who people are and where they're from. And so people always ask, what town are you from? And there's all these towns in eastern Massachusetts. And then people usually ask where you went to school. And it's not done in a judgmental way, I think. But I think between your ethnicity, where you lived in all those towns in and around Boston, and where you went to school, I think helps people kind of just position, where's this person coming from?
I think so.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, because Boston is kind of a small town, that if you say a town that I'm familiar with or I have a friend from, I was like, oh, you must know Joey.
Yeah. But it's funny, when I moved to Los Angeles 13 years ago now, they don't do that, interestingly. Now,
everyone's from back east.
Yeah, and almost everyone's from somewhere else. And interestingly, they don't ask your hometown usually. The assumption is almost everybody's from somewhere else.
Yep.
I think this happens a lot when I lived in New York as well. And I know you've lived in Los Angeles. And people don't ask where you went to school. It's a sort of an East Coast thing.
Yeah.
But it's the Reindeer Star thing. That's
what were
new
we
to
talking
me.
about before this? Which I actually derailed this conversation.
We talked about the fact that when your name is Bill Thomas, you can be a little hard to find.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And you two have very beautiful,
Thank
distinctive,
you.
European-sounding names, but the two of you would not be hard to find.
Right.
If someone, let's say, wanted to,
Bring it on.
stalk you.
Give you some info for a case, perhaps. Now,
Or if they wanted to, for example, show you a thrill.
oh boy, here we go.
Oh my! Wait,
Long story,
Did
Bill.
this person show up at your door or anything?
No.
Thankfully not.
We could show you something off air though. Speaking
my.
of off air, you mentioned that there were a lot of persons of interest in this case. I think you said up to 150.
That's what the FBI agents have told us. There's 150 persons of interest. Now, the experts tell me that in an unsolved case like the Colonial Parkway murders, there are 150 persons of interest. It's probably plus now. But no one's taken off the list. You're either on the likely list, which is or the so-called short list, which I've always guessed is. No, my guess is that's probably 10 or 15 names that would be the most likely.
I see.
And then there might be a bunch of other people that probably are less likely, but whose names have been mentioned in connection with the case. I have joked before, somewhat ruefully, that there are days when I feel like I know the 150 people.
I'm sure you've heard that many names, right?
There's
Maybe.
got to be cross-pollination.
Yeah.
Well, I could probably rattle off the 10 or 15, most likely names, off the top of my head, which I don't know if the brother of the murder victim is supposed to, have all these names buzzing around.
Well,
in your head.
there are no rules. You make the rules here.
And in theory, Bill, you're supposed to be too emotional to investigate this.
Yeah, and I suppose, but look, I'm not saying I don't have my emotional moments, but for the most part, with the passage of time, you're able to get a bit more perspective.
Yeah.
But we were talking about this new podcast you're doing on Sheila Shepherd, and very interesting case, and I asked you, how many people are on the short list, and you hit me with a really surprisingly small number, and I was like, whoa, there's a situation where investigators with a fresh look, and maybe with some help from the two of you, can hopefully move that case forward. And the science, the stuff that's going on with forensic genealogy and advanced DNA testing, I mean, in the last 2 years, never mind 5 or 10, we've seen significant changes and refinements.
I can't remember if we asked this the last time, but some of the evidence from the Colonial Parkway murders say the blanket that was covering Lauer and Phelps?
Phelps, Lauer, right?
The blanket that was covering them, was that taken? Does that still exist? Can we get DNA off of anything?
Getting straight answers to it's a real good question. I can't give you a good answer.
Well, that's probably a good sign, right?
Well, there are
yeah.
there are times when I wish the families, and look, I'm not directly related to Anna Maria Phelps or Daniel Lauer, so I don't want to imply that as the so-called leader of the Colonial Parkway murders that the Virginia State Police has any obligation to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a family member, but I know those families, and I've asked plenty of questions in the Thomas Dowski murder and had difficulty getting straightforward answers. Again, the families, we're not trying to insert ourselves in the investigation, but it does get very frustrating to ask questions and be told, oh, we can't tell you that, we can't tell you that, we can't tell you that.
Right.
In other words, even if you just want to know, like, do you still have the blanket? Has the blanket been tested? Which I think is a reasonable question coming from my friends in the Phelps and Lauer families. They're not going to answer the question for me. I get that, but they should, especially after 30 years.
Have they taken any DNA from that family? Do you know of?
Well, I don't think they have. Now, it's funny. I was in the room in January 2010 at the FBI when they took DNA from the Call and Haley families while we watched, which was interesting. I'd never seen them do the oral swab and, take the DNA. And I remember just sort of, collapsing inside because they didn't ask for the Thomas and Dowski families' DNA. Then about 3 or so years ago, we got the call. They wanted to come, and the FBI wanted to come to our offices, the three brothers, my older brother Richard, then me, and my younger brother Jack, to our respective offices. I was in Los Angeles, Richard in Washington, D.C., Jack in New York, and the FBI agents came and took our DNA. And from my point of view, that's a really good sign, because that means they have something to compare it
They have a reason to take it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, they're not going to send 6 agents from the local offices, the field offices as they call them, and waste a couple of hours of their time just to, keep me satisfied. There was a reason why they took this DNA, and it was for, elimination purposes.
So this is like 13 or 14 years ago?
No, this is like 3 or so years ago.
Oh, okay.
3,
Sorry,
yeah.
I confused the time
Just a
frame.
couple of years
No
ago.
kidding.
And I remember I asked our case agent, do we end up in the CODIS system,
Yeah.
which is the FBI system for DNA profiles of people who have been convicted of crimes or charged with certain serious crimes and so on. And she said no. And she said, and I said, why? And she said, well, you're good guys and we don't suspect you of any other crimes. And I thought, oh, well, that's probably a good
Did you
sign.
give like an evil laugh?
Good thing.
Yes. my evil career can continue.
Yes.
Twirl your mustache.
Yes, if they only knew. But that's a really good sign. So I know that the 4 FBI families, if you will, Thomas, Dowski, Call, Haley, they have taken our DNA. It's funny. That's a good question. I'll try to find out if the Phelps and Lauer families have ever given their DNA.
That's interesting. And did you ask them what they had to compare it to?
I did, and of course they refused to answer the question.
They didn't give you the picture, like the full-blown,
Nope.
like detailed breakdown of what they were going to start
No,
comparing it
and
to?
I'm not proud of this. I am an Irishman, and I do have a bit of a temper sometimes. I have lost my temper a few times when I've asked questions of our investigators at the FBI, and I get the usual, "Oh, we can't tell you that" reply. But I understand it. I haven't lost my perspective completely, but it can be frustrating to just want to know real basic things.
Yeah, like was it from a car? Like was it from
or
an article of clothing?
Well, and was mostly from my point of view, have you conducted the latest tests, to the limits of 2019 technology? Remember, our evidence all predates, so many developments. The CODIS system wasn't available. The AFIS, the fingerprint system, wasn't online. DNA hadn't even come out of the lab in 1986. So many significant developments that help move cases forward today weren't even around when our case first started.
I mean, it could be something like they made an arrest recently on a separate case that might have a similarity or two, and they're trying to compare that person's DNA and sort of minus out the family members' DNA, the people who were killed, the victims, and actually isolate the killer's DNA? I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, almost like, exactly, isolate it, like,
yeah, make sure you know which is which. Yeah.
Well, and they asked me questions about whether or not I'd spent time in my sister's 1980 Honda Civic, Kathy's car, and I said yes. And so it was, I said I spent many pleasant hours bombing up and down the East Coast between the Naval Academy, where Kathy graduated, and my parents' house up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and my brothers as well. So obviously, you start to be able to put together, well, they could be looking at potential evidence from, inside the car where Kathy and Becky's bodies were found.
Now, just a few months ago, there was an article that I saw that you forwarded out on social media. It was about an arrest that was made, I believe, on the Colonial Parkway, if I'm not mistaken, or very close.
Well, an arrest was made of a man on 695 right outside Baltimore.
Okay.
This was a police impersonator who had pulled someone over on kind of one of those beltways around Baltimore, and to his misfortune, a real Maryland state trooper was driving by, and he saw that this car outfitted with lights and a man wearing a uniform that, at a glance, he was probably on the other side of the road, looked like some sort of law enforcement officer. And I love this image. The Maryland state trooper, I think, turned around from the other side of the road, swung back around, pulls up behind this guy who's in the middle of what appears to be a traffic stop, pulling over someone along the highway. So the real cop interrupts what turns out to be a fake cop, police impersonator, in the middle of pulling someone over on the highway. And this guy was armed and had a sidearm and a taser and a uniform, which turned out to be a security guard's uniform, but he had all the police equipment and the handcuffs and the whole 9 yards. And of course, they arrested him. Now, this guy turned out to be from the Newport News, Virginia area, and he's in his 50s, so he's old enough to have been around during the Colonial Parkway Murders era. And there's always been a theory, it's just a theory, but that the 4 double homicides in the Colonial Parkway Murders, to many investigators, feel like a traffic stop, or like the couple was stopped and then someone rolled up on them. And I remember they've used the expression that even as early on as Kathy and Becky's murder, the first murder, they said, "We think your sister and Ms. Dowski were approached by an authority figure." And I stopped them and said, "I'm sorry, we're confused. What's an authority figure?" And they said, "By that we mean law enforcement." And so this guy would have kind of fit that type of profile. In other words, he's obviously not law enforcement. He's actually a security guard, but he was presenting as a law enforcement officer and would have been old enough and grew up in the area near the Colonial Parkway.
What was his plan when he pulled those people over, right?
We don't know.
Highway.
Oh, yeah, we don't know.
Why are you impersonating a cop on the highway?
Why are you doing it at all? I mean, but I think the answer is to get the person that you've pulled over into a position where you can do something to them.
But what?
I don't know.
Highway.
But see, the two of
It's
you,
pretty brazen.
The two
Right?
of you are applying your non-sociopathic brain here.
Right.
I'm just saying, when I do it, I go down a back road.
Well, and the Colonial Parkway, in its own spooky way, is this 23-mile-long ribbon of land. And I've been out there at night. There is not a single traffic light or overhead light or anything. It is pitch black out there. And so that's a place where you could pull somebody over, and unless you were extremely unlucky and a National Park Service ranger or a York County, Virginia sheriff's department car came along, you probably could have an interaction with someone that you'd pulled over or you'd come up behind. Whereas on 695 outside Baltimore, I'm not sure that was necessarily the smartest move.
Now, what's the deal with this guy?
Well, of course, again, it's hard to get an update. I spoke to the Maryland State Police, and it's funny. I talked to a really nice supervisor there, was open to taking my call and so on, but he knew nothing about the Colonial Parkway murders, which is, admittedly a few hours south, but never heard of the case. And I just, I hipped him to the fact that this guy is from the area of the Colonial Parkway murders. He's in his 50s. He's old enough to have been involved in a case where the possibility of a police impersonator has been mentioned over and over again. I just wanted you to know that. He was, appreciative. I said, here's our contact at the FBI office, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not saying this guy is involved, but I think it's certainly worth a look.
Yeah, I don't like the idea that they just I don't know what they charged him for officially, but I imagine it's impersonating an officer. It's just not enough. Does it say there what they charged him with?
At the time, there were this guy's name is Timothy Irvin Trivet. It's been in the papers and so on. I think he was originally brought up on gun charges because he didn't have a permit for the revolver he was wearing.
Yeah, but what's the attempt? That's what I'm saying. It's attempted something. What's the attempt?
He's been charged with impersonating a police officer and multiple handgun charges.
I know. That's good. That's a good start. But what the heck was he planning to do?
Well, one of the things I was very struck by is in a number of states around the country, and this needs to be changed, impersonating a police officer is a misdemeanor.
It's too common. And way too common.
When you think about
I always laugh at that. That's insane.
No, I think all of us, when we're out, traveling the highways and byways of America, if we get pulled over by a police officer, we have to feel that this is really a police officer. And then, of course, it's also very important that our interaction with that police officer be in a respectful manner and in a non-threatening manner. And I know we the country have failed sometimes in that regard too. That's probably the understatement of the year. But how frightening is it to think that, let's say you are in a lonesome stretch of road like the Colonial Parkway or a lot of rural highways across the country, and you get pulled over, you'd at least like to believe that the person pulling you over is a sworn law enforcement officer and not some nut job with a gun and a blue light on the dashboard of his car.
And I'm not stopping that easily.
Single gun. The guy had guns.
I'm not stopping unless I know it's a cop, and that means that's a marked car for me personally. It's certainly
marked car, lights on.
Yeah.
Perhaps a siren.
Yeah.
For several years, by the way, people were advised regarding the Colonial Parkway, which is lonesome, were advised actually to not allow themselves to be pulled over until they got to a place where they could get off the Colonial Parkway and get to a place that had lights and people and so on. And, it's terrifying, I think, especially for women who are traveling, to think, I'm going to get pulled over and I'm not going to be sure whether this person is really a police officer.